And there is an explicit section in the small cell order that says local jurisdictions can make aesthetic decisions, they can make placement decisions, requiring Verizon to find a pole that actually complies with the city's ordinance, that is actually the least intrusive. Even if that means placing a pole, if that means rearranging a pole, that is not prohibition of service. It may be inconvenient, it is not a prohibition of service. And I get the sense that these things have been conflated a bit, that if Verizon has to do anything extra, anything more than what's the most convenient, they say, oh gosh, that's a prohibition of service. And that's not true. So I'm really disturbed by this notion that I keep hearing that, oh, the federal law says we can't do very much. Well, that's not true. The FCC order explicitly says you can make aesthetic decisions. You can make decisions on placement. State law says the same thing. So I appreciate that the town does not want to get sued. Nobody wants to get sued. I don't know if Verizon has actually threatened that, though that seems implicit in some of what's in the staff report, to be perfectly honest. There's that specter of, well, if you don't just let us come on in and let's approve this application, why we're going to have to sue you. Well, honestly, I think that's a bit of a paper tiger. You know, litigation is slow. Litigation is costly. And I can tell you, having represented carriers that put outside plant, including wireless antennas, the last thing you want is delay. What's better is to try to come together, find a solution that actually works for everyone, and then go forward in a bit more harmonious way. Verizon Wireless did not review the locations that my group proposed. They claim because they're on private property, not within the right-of-way, and well beyond the coverage objective. The staff report says the same thing. Our alternative locations were not actually analyzed. So my question to the council is, if the objective is to find the least intrusive location, how does one do that if you haven't considered alternative locations? I believe that's impossible. Least intrusive is not a well-defined term, as I think Mr. Ewing said earlier. However, these are English words, and the word least is a comparative word. It's a comparative term. That means you have to take into account all possibilities, and at the end of the day, you pick the one that seems the, quote, least intrusive. I don't believe that's happened here. So what our group has asked is to have the opportunity to actually have some conversation with Verizon, to have some conversation with staff, and see if we can find something that's going to be a more suitable location. So what we're really asking is for the opportunity to see if the community can work with Verizon and come up with a location that actually is going to comply with the ordinance and be acceptable to the community, because Verizon's going to be here for a long time. And it really would make sense for the community and Verizon to be able to have a good relationship that's based on transparency. We're asking for a process that's actually based on data. And as I said, most of what Mr. Albritton said this evening is actually not in the record. That alone is problematic. I think if you're worried about withstanding judicial scrutiny, you probably want to have the most robust record you possibly can. So I believe there are vertical structures that are actually in the public right-of-way. There is an area around that EB mud location that is public right-of-way. And if for some reason the streetlights are owned by PG&E, and I don't see how the town council can say, oh, no, we can't move the pole from the one that's the objective pole right now. We can't move it 500 feet over here to be at the very edge of the EB mud property, because someday in the future, maybe there's going to be a different pole a little further around that's going to have a Verizon antenna on it. I mean, I think you have to take this as it is. As I think you said earlier, this is one pole. And you can only look at the application that's in front of you. And the application in front of you is a pole that's within, we believe, 25 feet. We had someone go measure it. I don't see how you can say, oh, well, we'll leave it there because someday, somehow, Verizon may put something further down by the EB mud facility. That's just not the way due process works. You really have to take this one in isolation because Verizon decided to submit it in isolation, right? They could have given you a very large master plan, as you've talked about, and they chose not to do that. And that's problematic. I can tell you under the California Environmental Quality Act, which you're probably familiar with, there's something called piecemealing. And what that means is an applicant is not allowed to come in and say, well, I just want to build a parking lot here. and then come back later and say, oh, did I mention I want to put a shopping center there too? Right? That's purposely misleading, and it's actually forbidden under CEQA. It seems to me the same thing should apply here. You should have some general idea of what it is that Verizon is trying to accomplish so that, as you've pointed out, Mayor, if you move this pole a little bit that way, then that has a cascading effect. But how are you to decide that? How are you to decide what actually is least intrusive and what's workable for coverage objectives when you don't know what that is? There's no master plan that I've seen, so you can't tell. If we move it down closer to EB Mud, does that actually affect something else? We don't know, because there's no data in the record that would support that. So, again, what we're asking for is transparency, some kind of process that actually gives the local residents the ability to have some input and to comply with the ordinance. If you're thinking about statutory, or in this case, ordinance interpretation, the general rule is that if there is something general in a law and something very specific in a law, and they conflict in some way, then the specific trumps the generic or the general. And we were all talking earlier about the section on page 4, that's 32-70.5. The first word there is general permit requirements. And that's the A or the B that they're saying directs you to realize that when you actually go over to the development standards, that somehow these development standards only apply when it's on private property. But the mayor pointed this out. I mean, if you just read these 7 locations, it explicitly uses the word in the public rights of way. And I may be confused about this, but in my experience, private property is the opposite of public right of way. Now, you can certainly have a utility corridor on private property, but this is a term of art. Public rights of way means public rights of way. And so it may be that this generic section was intended to feed into the development standards section, but that's not the plain letter of what's actually here. In fact, every one of the choices mentions public rights of way. So it is certainly my group's contention that these 7 development standards apply both on private property and in the public rights of way. And applying these rules, Verizon's location is not compliant. And it doesn't say that this is, at your discretion. It says that these shall be considered discouraged. All applicants for a land use permit must propose new wireless facilities and locations according to these 7 preferences. And Verizon has failed to do that. And you've heard from Verizon, they've got more things queued up and ready to go. So on this first test, I would just urge the council to be very cautious and very thoughtful about how this ordinance works. The plain language here doesn't seem to support what Verizon has said. And I think if you allow them to start putting antennas within 50 feet or 25 feet, whatever it is, of a residence, you're going to see other applications just like that. And then Verizon will say to you, oh, but you already approved one like that. In fact, Mr. Albritton this evening said he's had 2 applications approved that were very similar to the location that he's proposing or his client is proposing. I wonder, are there actually 2 approved applications that are within 50 feet of a residence? This town council has an absolute right to require Verizon to comply with its ordinance. And in fact, with all due respect, the council has an obligation to enforce this ordinance. So at the moment, all you can think about is this one antenna that Verizon has submitted to you and decide, is it really the least intrusive location? Does it or does it not have to be at least 125 feet from a residential dwelling? And what your ordinance says to me is that Verizon's proposed location does not comply with your ordinance. And I think what we're looking for from the council is if you put some teeth behind this ordinance, Verizon is going to be a lot more willing to sit down with the local community and negotiate with us. And if you don't do that, we basically have no power whatsoever.
Least intrusive means, it's pull past the test of least intrusive means because it's the least visible. So they keep referencing a tree backdrop. And I appreciate the drawing of that backdrop. There's 14 trees surrounding that pole. Do you know who owns 13 of those 14 trees? My parents do. And I mean, we can just as easily cut those down. It would make it completely visible, right? So they've been growing those trees for 40 years, and I hope we don't have to cut those trees down.
And one of the things that's a little bit of a concern, some people have asked them, how far have they gone in talking to residents, et cetera, and many of us have volunteered to talk to them. But I want to make the point here that, in fact, a lot of what the appellant done is what should have been done by the applicant. It's the applicant's onus to look at sites and say that it makes the least intrusive. During the course of this process, because stuff wasn't done and information wasn't being passed on, the appellant actually went and did that work paid for by citizens. That's not the way this should be. It's the applicant's job, and the applicant should be paying for it, or maybe the city pays for some of it. But what's happened is citizens have had to, basically contribute money to do work that is really the work of the applicant.